Hi, my name is Brittany Lavery, and this is my master's thesis presentation on ex-convicts and their perspective of the services they received during incarceration and how those services prepared them for community reintegration. The purpose of this study was to understand what makes long-term ex-convicts successful at community reintegration versus the short-term success of their counterparts. Information was collected on the programs provided in prison and the supports and barriers experienced by these individuals post-release. Most importantly, whether the individuals saw themselves as successful after being released and whether or not they feel that they'll be rearrested despite the services they received. There were 2 participants that were interviewed face-to-face or through phone interviews with predetermined questions. Those questions were then transcribed and analyzed using the inductive approach to determine themes related to previous research and that helped determine the path of future research that could be taken to improve the services and programs that are currently being implemented in prisons. The aim of this research was to increase the understanding of the current care being provided to these individuals and how it's received by these individuals in preparation for community reintegration. The results of the process of this research was that even though the confidence level was low pre-release for these individuals, they were able to accomplish long-term results based off of the individual services that were given to them in prison, and especially post-release. Post-release, the people interviewed had clear goals and made considerable life changes, and despite that, they still had concerns about being rearrested due to the ease of outside barriers during community living. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to thank a few people. This research would not be possible without the contributions of faculty at Tennessee Wesleyan University, the student body, or the employees at the Disability Resource Center. The faculty at Tennessee Wesleyan University has entered endless questions and badgering in order to perfect this project, specifically my thesis chair and faculty advisor who helped me through many ups and downs. I'd also like to thank the students in cohort 1 of the Masters of Occupational Therapy program who have critiqued and questioned and persevered through many presentations on this topic. I'd like to give that special thanks to the students that helped me network during a global pandemic, and I'd like to thank the employees at the Disability Resource Center for doing that same thing. Lastly, I'd like to thank my family for reading every draft of every paper that led to this moment. The process for the literature review started actually at the beginning of my program in 2019 when I was introduced to the importance of this topic. From there, I found articles starting more specifically in August 2020 through PubMed, Tennessee Wesleyan University Library, South College Library, and Utah Valley University Library with supplements from Google Scholar. Once I had a good collection of articles that were peer-reviewed, I pulled from the reference sections of those articles in order to increase the breadth and depth of my article collection. All but a few are within the last 10 years, and the ones that aren't are historically significant to understanding the basics of this topic. Keywords that were used in the search for this literature were inmates, prisoners, jail, recidivism, mental health, family support, and social support. To introduce this topic, the literature was reviewed and assisted in helping gain knowledge about risk factors and hardships that are common to inmates and recently released ex-offenders. And we'll go a little bit more into those hardships during our review of the literature. But the purpose of this thesis evolved from the gaining of this knowledge in order to fill gaps and build on previous studies. The scope of this study is to gauge the level of preparation amongst inmates to understand their motivations for success, specifically what services were given to them while they were in prison, and how they utilized those services in order to become successful outside of prison, and understanding what drove them in order to overcome the short-term barriers and long-term barriers of living in society with stigma. Occupational therapy programs are commonly implemented in prisons to prevent occupational deprivation in order to negate some of the stigma, and for many reasons. The research that we reviewed helped understand what was successful about those programs, what was unsuccessful, and we were able to create an understanding in order to fill those gaps. Let's go ahead and get started and look a little deeper into the literature on this topic. Here's a little overview, a little graphic about what research is out there. Through all the research that we created or looked into, we found that there were specific topics that were important or repetitive throughout all the research, specifically diversity, low income, mental and physical health, and culture of crime. Those were things that led to the arrest of individuals, and then during the sentences of these individuals, topics included occupational deprivation, occupational enrichment, and vocational training. And then after they're released, a lot of topics that were studied or researched include community reintegration, employment rates, stigma, recidivism, family supports, and social supports. The first topic that we talk about in the literature review is diversity. In recent years, research shows that women are being arrested more, or building up to the majority. It also showed that those being released from prison and then being readmitted were most likely people who were African American, aged 30 years or younger, or committing drug-related crimes. Though those people are being arrested, they also found that those who are in an African American population actually receive less help in prison for mental health, for substance abuse, and drugs because of that poverty and racism. Low income and financial burdens are also a topic that was discussed in the literature review. They found that those who live in poor income neighborhoods or low income brackets were more likely to be arrested, and then when they were released back into those neighborhoods and had more chances for recidivism. That became such a great cycle that people who are being rearrested are actually growing in percentages. Mental health and physical health are a big subject that is starting to take huge precedence nowadays, especially with the global pandemic that's been happening. People in prison do not have access to physical health care, but also mental health care. People who are arrested tend to have mental illnesses that aren't discovered until they're arrested, and even when they're taken care of in prisons, the services are spotty, they're not very consistent, and they tend to be done in group settings, which we'll find out later, individual services are actually more beneficial. And the greatest mental illness that were found in prisons happens to be schizophrenia, but they're followed closely by depression and anxiety. A culture of crime is a very interesting topic that was discovered in the literature review. It talked about how a lot of people are young when they're arrested, usually within the ages of 17 to 20, and they go to prison and become surrounded by people who know more about crime than them, And when they get released, they tend to keep those relationships that they formed in prison instead of going back to ones that are more supportive. Occupational deprivation is a huge topic that's been covered by occupational therapists for years. It talks about how people in prison are deprived of ADLs and IADLs that are human rights. Some of the ones that are talked about in the literature review are the right to vote, the right to make choices about their therapeutic services, the right to have finances and safety or acquire skills that can help them later on once they're released. Which leads us into occupational enrichment, which are all the programs that exist in order to counteract that deprivation. A lot of times they try to teach them skills, though those programs are lacking. Often they don't have the tools or materials that they need, or they teach about life skills, but they don't actually they teach about the need for life skills, but they don't teach them those life skills themselves, which from the research that we talk about later, we find that is a huge problem with being released and having a community lifestyle. The last one is vocational training, which the hope of this is to help improve employment rates down the road. Community reintegration is often talked about because there are two different aspects. The process of going from in-prison services to outside post-release services, especially within the community, they tend to be programs such as Alcohol Anonymous or support groups. And the research shows that cognitive behavioral therapy alone, though very helpful, could be expanded upon if community reintegration programs helped supplement that. A lot of the research here is limited due to the fact that they only follow people who are released for 6 months to a year, and other research that you can find online or find with the census, they follow people for up to 9 years and find that many of the individuals, I think it was up to 80% of the individuals, end up being arrested 9 years within those 9 years, most of them being rearrested within the first 6 months. But if we had more programs or more effective programs with community reintegration, those numbers would definitely decrease. Employment rates was an interesting topic because though the employment rates looked successful at a first glance, a lot of the employment was inconsistent. They'd be hired for a month or 2 months at a time, and then they'd have to find something else. They had a lot of difficulty fighting the barrier of their record and finding consistent employment because of that, or the people were trying to work 2 to 3 jobs in order to support themselves in order to leave the life behind that they were trying to recover from. Recidivism is a fancy word for rearrest, and like we've talked about before, rearrests are very common once you've been released. Usually people who have violent crimes are rearrested more often, and those who violate their parole, which if you violate your parole, you get arrested just on that as alone. So it's very easy once you've been released to be rearrested despite the progress that you've made. Stigma, we've talked about with employment. Lots of employers don't want to hire someone with a record, but also the stigma against prisoners kind of locks them into a lifestyle that brought them to that moment, that arrest in the first place. So they kind of get stuck in a cycle. Social supports is very vital. Family and social supports lead to better decision making, long-term results, and reduce the rates of arrest. Here are just 2 research articles in particular. The first one is kind of mirrors the research that I wanted to do. It is an interview with ex-offenders that have been released 6 months to 20 years, and they discovered that finding work, working around a record, family rejection, and social supports reinforce those criminal behaviors. A lot of times finding work was difficult and discouraging. The stigma that was presented from others were internalized, and they started to believe that they were criminals, or they started to label themselves as offenders, and that sort of compounded into locking them into a different the lifestyle that they've come to know. The other one is a very important one. It's a special report. It was done in 2 parts, one in 2015 and then one in 2018. And it goes over a lot of the numbers and the statistics, and a lot of the programs and the research that has been done up to this point follows statistical patterns because it's very easy to track. It includes criteria such as almost 70,000 state prisoners over 30 states, and they were released starting in 2005 to 2009, and then reanalyzed. Their numbers were reanalyzed years later. They found that within 9 years, 89.9% of prisoners were male, 40% were African American, 36 were aged 30 or younger, and 31 had committed a drug-related crime. But most importantly, 83% of prisoners were released and then rearrested within those 9 years, showing that long-term results are hard to track and are not very successful. So let's get into the research that was accomplished based on all of this previous research. As mentioned before, many of the programs and areas that are researched use quantitative data and focus on race, employment, and family supports. I was curious, based on this research, what the individual felt. So a lot of the questions that I had covered, do programs actually improve the success of community reintegration from the perspective of the ex-offender or the ex-convict? Are the services provided during incarceration helping to negate the concerns about community living? Are the services in prisons supporting and preparing them for the decisions that they'll need to make in the community after they're released? And then what supports are beneficial for long-term community living? Not just that 6 months to a year, but 9 years from now, are those individuals still going to be successful? What barriers promote rearrest? And the last one, the most important one, do ex-convicts see themselves as being rearrested despite the programs that exist? Just a little timeline for the research and what it took to accomplish this. Though research was being collected in 2020 or even before that, IRB approval was January 2021. Interviews were conducted in the month of February. That information gained from the interviews was recorded and transcribed. The transcriptions were finished in March 2021. That transcription allowed the data to be analyzed, and themes were taken from that in April 2021, which included meetings with thesis chairs and discussions about many of the themes to try and root out biases. And then in May, the thesis was completed. So the research design and methods is a qualitative analysis of 2 individuals and their stories of rehabilitation during and after release from prison. It uses a grounded theory approach and an inductive approach to find themes, but to also provide an explanation for the rising rearrest rates among prisoners. The inductive approach was used as a means for analysis, and that all of the information was taken after the interviews were completed in order to find the themes from that. Participants were found through a convenience sample through people that were already known by the interviewer, and both interviewees read and signed a contract, a consent form, before participating in the interview. One interview was a phone interview, the other one was face-to-face, but all answered the same questions, and the questions ranged from 12 minutes to 40 minutes depending on how much they elaborated on each question. Interview questions were designed in order to discover the source of the motivation and what they felt prepared them for leaving prison, the supports they had, the barriers they had, and whether they believed that they could be successful after release. Those answers were recorded and transcribed and analyzed by the interviewee and the Thesis committee in order to root out bias and limitations. Just to prepare you for the findings that were analyzed afterwards, I'm just going to go through all the questions that were asked. The first one was, on a scale from 1 to 10, how prepared were you to live in the community successfully after your release? 1 being not prepared and 10 being very prepared. The second one was, did you have any concerns about being reintroduced to the community? What prepared you? What services did you have while you were incarcerated? And then what things were deprived from you while incarcerated? And then they were asked to expand on that question. And then a question, what activities and opportunities for growth meant the most for you while in prison? These questions were just to find a baseline about what their life was like in prison, what their concerns were as they prepared to leave prison, and whether they had a clear understanding of what they needed to do in order to have long-term success in the community. These questions were more for after prison, but they were vital for helping us understand what has helped them be successful. So, what are your goals and aspirations for the type of life you want outside of prison, and how have you made progress towards that, accomplishing your goals? And did any of the services you received in prison help you work towards those goals? Do you have a support system? And if they had a support system, how will that support system help you meet those goals and aspirations? And then, do you feel there are any barriers working against you? If so, what are they? Is there a situation where you see yourself having a relapse? What consequences could result from that relapse? And then the accumulation of all these questions, do you see yourself being arrested? And then explain why. So when the participants were asked if they were prepared for community reintegration, the answer was no, they weren't. Most of them answered, well, both of them answered below 5, rating them as not prepared for community reintegration. When asked if they had concerns about being reintroduced into the community and what those were, fears and concerns about fixing previous lifestyle behaviors were mentioned, and what they had to do in order to accomplish their goals led them to anxiety and concerns or fears about community living, community reintegration. The question about preparation for community reintegration and what programs impacted their desires to be successful once relieved, the services mentioned moral reconation therapy, individual treatment plans, and Alcohol Anonymous. Those were all things that helped them prepare for community reintegration. Additional services that they received while in prison were a program called the Matrix Method, or various different programs that were Christian-based or had religious undertones. The question about occupational deprivation led to a lot of interesting insight into what is actually deprived of prisoners while they're in prison. And I think this led to a lot more information than statistics show, specifically things like the removal of individuality or choice. Everything's provided to you, such as your clothing, underwear, and socks, and how everything is washed in the same washer machine, and that you get meals, but only a certain amount, and you don't get extras, and you get a very thin blanket and pillows. So basically every aspect of your life is chosen for you: when you go to bed, when you wake up, what activities you do. It's very regulated, and it's very much the same person to person. The question about opportunities for growth that meant the most for them while they were in prison led to discussions about the importance of one-on-one therapy. A lot of them, both of them mentioned that individualized treatment was beneficial in helping them turn their lives around. It led to self-reflection and self-development that helped them create goals for when they were released, which led to the next question about what goals they had for when they left. Both of them had goals for sobriety or abstinence, and research participant 2 mentioned that family relationships was very high on her goal. So many of the opportunities in prison led to a developed goal that helped them throughout their reintegration process, and these goals stayed with them throughout the whole process of community reintegration. The question on support systems included answers such as sponsors. Both participants had individual sponsors that they accredited to much of their success. Those sponsors met with them daily, at least when they first were released. I can't remember the specific date, but they met with them or called them every day for a very long time, and they talked about their struggles. They gave them advice. They helped them through many of the ups and downs, and from that point on, they kept in contact with their sponsors. They would call them every other day or once a week, and those sponsors helped them through many challenges and overcoming barriers. So again, that one-on-one support, that one-on-one care is very important in the rehabilitation of offenders. Barriers that they felt were a part of community reintegration had things like your record. Finding employment was very difficult, and the research participant 2 stated specifically that she struggled with barriers that kept her from being a part of her family, helping her children, or those barriers were life-changing. Both participants had to think through many of their daily activities in order to negate things that wouldn't be thought of by the average population, such as who you get in a car with, or where you go. You can't go to public parks, or it's very much individualized, but barriers, it required them to put extra effort into avoiding wrong place, wrong time situations in order to avoid rearrest. Which led to question 10, which is whether they felt that they would relapse. And that led to the last question of, do you see yourself being rearrested? And though both of them felt that relapse was possible, they were doing everything they could to avoid it, and they felt that relapse wasn't in the cards for them. And lastly, there was uncertainty about the fact that they could be rearrested. Despite all of the things that they had done and overcome, there was still a chance that they could be rearrested just because of the ease of recidivism, the ease of being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person, and having that on their record leads them to a vulnerability that is possible, that isn't necessary in the the average population. From the questions, the themes that were developed or picked through were the loss of autonomy that led to a lack of preparation, and clear goals, change of volition, ease of recidivism, and support systems. So for the loss of autonomy, in prison, you just don't get a lot of choice. Your pride is taken from you, everything's taken from you, and you're treated very much the same. So meaningful choice and occupations that are key to individualization were deprived of these prisoners and led to less opportunities and growth for individual capacity that could have helped in rehabilitation. The lack of preparation was a huge theme in these interviews. Life skills such as paying your bills or going to work, having a work-life balance, coming home, taking care of yourself, going to bed and getting up, that was new to them. Previous to arrest, those habits and routines were not in place, and they were very unprepared for learning those skills or being taught those skills during prison and after release. Despite that, they each had a very clear goal of what they wanted their life to look like after they were released, and that goal drove them to success. For both of them, the goal included leaving behind a certain habit and then developing a relationship or support system that would help them accomplish that goal. A change in volition. Both of them, while in prison, received services that helped change their motivations, that changed their outlook on life. Research participant 2 said that for her it was very much a religious change. She was able to re-establish or forgive individuals in her past for things that had been hard. Research participant 1 stated that he changed his lifestyle because he wanted to be moving in the right direction, and to do that they participated in services, or they dedicated themselves to what was provided to them in prison. The ease of recidivism was very important because the literature that was analyzed beforehand mentioned a lot of statistics about who was rearrested or what they were rearrested for, but it didn't mention why they were rearrested. And the opportunities or the situations that come with life that I wouldn't have thought about in a day-to-day setting were things that they had to think about often. And some of those things were messing up and missing a call to your parole officer, or missing a call to your sponsor. Another one was if the people around you make choices, you are often blamed or can be labeled with their consequences, and so you have to be very careful about who you associate with, and you have to be very careful who you build your support system with. So it's very easy to include someone in your support system without realizing it that can put you at risk for rearrest, which leads to support systems. Both of them mentioned that sponsors were vital to staying out and having what they needed in order to leave behind certain lifestyles. Research participant 2 also mentioned that her family was vital for long-term success, and research participant 1 had multiple support systems across the state that they lived in, with different support groups such as Alcohol Anonymous or teaching opportunities in those kind of realms. The limitations and biases are often, because of the style of research that was presented, there's a limited sample size. In individualized questions were asked and individualized answers were received. So it's very personal and based on personal experiences, and so subjects have participant bias. Those steps were taken to remove interviewer bias. Bias may still be present, and that is something that you have to look into while analyzing qualitative research like this research was. The most beneficial services for change, according to ex-convicts, were individualized services and long-term goals that provide focus for overcoming barriers, and a positive support system, as we mentioned before, on multiple accounts. The contributions of this research to OT are vast. OTs are uniquely trained for client-centeredness and individualized treatment that educate in ADLs or activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living that could prepare individuals for community reintegration and prevent rearrest because of that. OTs would be a great addition to programs that are already being implemented to expand and further the success of these people that are leaving the field. As always, further research needs to be done in order to address these concerns. Another thought about OTs is they're very good advocators, and this is a population that needs advocating for. On a promotional level, on a legislative level, this field is neglected, and it would be a great opportunity for occupational therapists to apply their client-centered care and help this neglected and often deprived population fight barriers and difficulties and help them with long-term success. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for joining and listening in on this presentation. I'm so grateful for the opportunity I had to learn about this population and for understanding a little bit better what I, as an occupational therapist, can do to help this population. If you have any questions or if you have any comments, please leave them below or reach out to me, and I will be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much.